Hey, before we start, quick note. This story is long, really long, so I split it into 2 parts and uploaded both at the same time. Yes, I know, same video twice on the channel. My bad. Next time I will do better, but the story is worth it. Trust me. Now let's go. My name is Vladislav. I'm a courier in Moscow, Russia. Every single day I get on my bike and ride through this city delivering packages for Wildberries. South Moscow, Butovo district. I take orders when I want. I ride when I feel like it. And while I ride, I film everything I see. My English is 0. That's why you hear a voice that is not mine, but everything you see right now on your screen is completely real. Those are my streets. Those are my people. That is my city. I started this channel because I realized something that nobody else was doing. I ride through one of the most misunderstood cities on the planet every single day, and nobody was showing it the way I see it. Not from the street, not from a bike, not from the inside. So I decided to do it myself. Every week I ride through Moscow and I tell you a story. Today's story is about something that will genuinely surprise you. There are things that happen on these streets every single day that are completely normal here. Things that nobody thinks twice about. Things that are just part of life in this city. But if you did any one of these things in America, you would be fined, or arrested, or both. Sit back, watch Moscow through my camera, and listen. Because by the end of this video, you are going to understand something about freedom and law and culture that most people never think about. Let's go. Number 1, drinking alcohol in public. Right now, if you look at the people around me on this street, you might see someone walking with an open beer, not hiding it, not being secretive about it, just walking down the street drinking a beer the way you would walk down the street drinking a coffee. In Moscow, this is completely normal. People drink beer in parks, they drink wine on benches, they sit outside cafes with open bottles and watch the world go by, and nobody looks twice, and nobody calls anyone, and nothing happens because nothing needs to happen because nothing wrong is occurring. A person drinking a beer while walking through a park on a warm afternoon is doing something that has been done in this city for generations, and that the city has decided does not require intervention. In most American states, this is a misdemeanor offense. An open container of alcohol in a public space can result in a fine. In some jurisdictions, it can result in arrest. The law exists to prevent public intoxication and the antisocial behavior that can accompany it. This is a reasonable goal. The question is whether the law achieves it and at what cost. In Moscow, the absence of open container laws has not produced streets full of drunk and disorderly people. It has produced streets where adults occasionally drink a beer while walking home from work, and then go home and have dinner with their families, and nothing remarkable happens. The assumption behind American open container laws is that adults cannot be trusted to drink alcohol in public without becoming a problem. The assumption behind Moscow's approach is that most adults can be trusted to make reasonable decisions about their own behavior. Both assumptions produce different cities. Neither city is obviously worse than the other. But the difference in what is legal and what is normal tells you something important about how the two cultures think about individual freedom and collective responsibility. I see this every single day on my route. People sitting in parks with a beer after work, not causing problems, not bothering anyone, just unwinding after a long day in the way that feels natural to them. And nobody arrests them. Nobody fines them. Nobody treats them like criminals for making a personal choice about how to spend their own time in a shared public space that belongs to all of them equally. Number 2, buying medicine without a prescription. That pharmacy you can see on the corner right there, the one that looks completely ordinary with the green cross sign that you see on every block in this city. In America, a pharmacy is where you go after a doctor has already told you what you need. The process is specific and it is expensive and it is time-consuming in ways that have nothing to do with how sick you are, and everything to do with how the American healthcare system is structured around liability and insurance, and the institutional protection of everyone involved except the sick person who just needs medicine. You feel unwell. You call a doctor. The doctor has an appointment available in 3 weeks. You go to urgent care instead, and pay $300 for a 10-minute conversation with someone who asks you to describe symptoms you already knew you had before you walked in. The doctor writes a prescription. You take the prescription to a pharmacy and pay another $50 for medicine that costs $5 to manufacture. Total cost for a common bacterial infection that you already knew you had, and already knew what you needed for it. $350 and 3 hours of your life, and 2 weeks of feeling sick while you waited for the system to permit you to treat yourself. In Moscow, you walk into that pharmacy on the corner. You describe your symptoms to the pharmacist. The pharmacist, who is a trained professional with years of education in exactly this kind of situation, recommends a treatment based on what you describe. You buy it. You go home. Total time, 10 minutes. Total cost, $5. No appointment, no prescription, no insurance required, no waiting room full of other sick people who also waited 3 weeks for an appointment because the system requires it. Just medicine for a sick person sold by a trained professional who is perfectly capable of making a recommendation for a sore throat or a bacterial infection without a doctor being formally involved in the transaction. I have used this system my entire life. Every Russian has used this system their entire life. The idea that you need formal medical authorization to buy medicine for a common illness is something that Russians find genuinely incomprehensible when they learn about it. Not because they do not understand why the rule exists, but because the rule prioritizes the protection of the system over the well-being of the sick person in a way that is very difficult to defend from the outside. Number 3. Letting children play outside alone. Those kids you can see in the courtyard over there. The youngest one looks about 6 years old, maybe 7. There are no parents visible anywhere in the area. No adults hovering nearby ready to intervene if anything goes slightly wrong. Just children playing in a courtyard in the middle of a city of 12 million people, the way children have played in courtyards in this city for generations, without anyone deciding that this required supervision or intervention or formal risk assessment. In America, this situation would trigger serious concern from neighbors who saw it. It might result in a call to Child Protective Services. A parent who allowed a 6-year-old to play outside alone in an urban area, even in a safe area, even in a courtyard where everyone knows everyone, would face judgment from other parents and potentially investigation from authorities who have been given the responsibility of determining whether children are being adequately supervised. The concept of children having genuine independence and freedom of movement has essentially disappeared from American mainstream culture over the last 30 years, in a process that has been driven by a combination of media coverage of rare but dramatic child safety incidents, liability concerns among institutions, and a general cultural shift toward the belief that children require constant adult supervision to be safe. In Russia, this shift has not occurred in the same way. Children here walk to school alone from the age of 7 or 8. They take the metro by themselves at ages that would horrify many American parents. They play outside without constant adult supervision in the way that children in this city have always played. And the result of this freedom is not a generation of injured or traumatized children. The result is children who develop spatial awareness and problem-solving skills, and the kind of self-reliance that comes from being trusted to manage yourself in the world from an early age. The Russian approach assumes competence. The American approach, increasingly, assumes fragility. Both assumptions shape the children who grow up under them in ways that extend far beyond childhood. Number 4. Jaywalking. Crossing the street wherever you want, whenever you want, without waiting for a designated crossing point or a green light, or the formal permission of the traffic management system. In America, jaywalking is illegal in most states and is enforced with varying degrees of consistency depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances. The fine varies, but the principle is the same. Pedestrians are supposed to cross at designated points and to wait for the appropriate signal, and to move through the urban environment according to the rules that have been established for the management of traffic flow. In Moscow, crossing the street is a negotiation between the people who are in it. You look at the cars. The cars look at you. Someone has the right of way, technically. In practice, someone yields and someone crosses, and both parties proceed with their day, and the street continues to function. This system works because everyone involved understands the informal rules of the negotiation and participates in it with the mutual awareness of people who share a space and have figured out over generations how to share it without needing formal enforcement of every crossing point. Moscow pedestrians cross wherever it makes sense to cross given where they are and where they are going. Moscow drivers expect pedestrians to cross wherever it makes sense to cross. The formal rules exist and are observed when they are convenient and negotiated when they are not, and the streets function adequately under this system. The American approach imposes more formal structure on this negotiation and enforces that structure legally. The Russian approach treats the negotiation as something that competent adults can manage between themselves without the law being involved in every instance. Number 5. Certain food sales and informal commerce. The woman selling homemade pickles from a folding table on the sidewalk. The man with jars of honey from his bees at his dacha. The family with mushrooms they picked themselves last weekend and brought to the city to sell to people who want them. The grandmother with preserves made from fruit she grew herself. These informal food sales happen throughout Moscow and throughout Russia, with a casualness and a directness that reflects a completely different regulatory relationship between small-scale food producers and the state. The seller and the buyer engage in a direct transaction that has existed for as long as trade has existed. Something is made or grown. Someone wants to buy it. Money is exchanged. Everyone goes home. In America, this transaction requires navigating a complex system of health permits and food handling certifications and commercial kitchen requirements and local vending licenses and zoning regulations that makes informal food sales essentially impossible in most jurisdictions without significant investment in compliance. The system exists to protect public health, and this is a legitimate goal. But it also makes illegal or practically impossible the kind of small-scale direct relationship between food producer and food consumer that sustained human communities for all of recorded history. The pickles from that folding table are made by someone who has been making pickles for decades, using a recipe that has been in their family longer than any of us have been alive. They are not made in a licensed commercial kitchen. They are not certified by any authority. They are just pickles, made well by someone who knows how to make them, sold to people who want them. The transaction requires no intermediary and no permission, and has not required either for as long as anyone in this city can remember. Number 6. Building and modifying property without extensive permits. Russia has a permit system for construction, and it applies to significant building projects in meaningful ways. But the relationship between what Russian citizens can do on their own land, particularly on dacha land outside the city, and what American homeowners can legally do on their own property without triggering a complex regulatory process, is significantly different in ways that reflect a deeper difference in how the two societies think about the relationship between a person and the land they own. Russians build things. They add rooms to existing structures. They construct bathhouses and garden buildings and storage sheds and small outbuildings with a practical directness that reflects the belief that what you do on your own land is primarily your own business, as long as it does not directly harm anyone else. The dacha, the small property outside the city that almost every Russian family with any means has or aspires to have, is a space of personal construction and personal modification that has been shaped over generations by the hands of the people who own it, rather than by the requirements of regulatory compliance. An American who decides to build even a small structure on their own land faces a process that involves applying for permits, waiting for approval, scheduling inspections at various stages of construction, ensuring compliance with building codes, and potentially significant expense before a single piece of wood is cut or a single nail is driven. The system exists for legitimate reasons. Building codes protect structural safety. Zoning regulations protect communities from incompatible land uses. These are real benefits that come from real regulatory oversight. But the system also creates a relationship between a person and their property that feels managed and supervised in ways that the Russian relationship with land does not. When a Russian decides to build a small structure at their dacha, they generally build it. When an American decides to build a small structure on their own property, they generally start a process that may take months and cost significant money before anything is built. The practical experience of ownership is different. The feeling of what it means to have land that is yours is different. And that difference reflects something real about how the two cultures understand the relationship between individual autonomy and collective oversight. Number 7. Keeping animals that would be restricted or prohibited in many American jurisdictions. Russia has regulations about animal ownership and particularly about certain categories of exotic or dangerous animals. These regulations exist and are enforced in certain contexts. But the practical reality of what people keep as pets and what authorities consistently choose to enforce is different from the American situation in several ways that reflect different assumptions about responsible animal ownership and individual choice. Dogs that are subject to breed-specific legislation in many American cities and states, breeds that have been identified as statistically more dangerous and whose ownership has been restricted or banned in certain jurisdictions, are common on the streets of Moscow. Large dogs of types that American cities have decided represent unacceptable risk in residential environments are walked through this city every day by their owners without legal consequence. The Russian approach to animal ownership reflects a general principle that competent and responsible adults are capable of making decisions about the animals they keep and managing those animals appropriately, and that the law should not preemptively restrict those decisions based on generalizations about animal breeds, rather than evidence about specific animals and the specific people who own them. The science on breed-specific legislation is actually fairly clear. Most animal behaviorists and trainers and researchers who study dog behavior conclude that breed is a poor predictor of dangerous behavior compared to factors like training, socialization, owner behavior, and individual animal temperament. Russia's lack of extensive breed-specific legislation reflects a position that happens to align with the scientific evidence on this question, even if that alignment is the result of cultural preference and regulatory tradition, rather than deliberate evidence-based policymaking. Number 8. A different relationship with noise in shared spaces. Moscow is a loud city, and it has always been a loud city, and the people who live in it have developed a relationship with urban noise that is different from the relationship that American noise ordinance culture has cultivated in many cities, and particularly in American suburbs. Construction happens in Moscow at hours that would trigger noise complaints and potential legal action in many American residential neighborhoods. Music plays from open apartment windows at volumes that American noise regulations in residential areas would prohibit. Neighbors interact across shared walls and shared courtyards and shared staircases with a directness and a volume that reflects a city where people live in close proximity and have developed a tolerance for the sounds of other people's lives that the American ideal of quiet, private domestic space does not quite accommodate. This is not the absence of noise regulation in Russia. Russian law includes noise restrictions and they are real and apply in certain contexts. But the practical enforcement of those regulations and the cultural norms around what constitutes acceptable urban noise reflect a different calibration of the trade-off between individual quiet and collective urban life. In American suburbs, noise complaints to local authorities over relatively modest sounds are common. Lawn mowers at certain hours, music at certain volumes, voices at certain times of night. In Moscow, the same situations are typically either resolved directly between neighbors or simply tolerated as part of the reality of living in a dense urban environment with 12 million other people who are also making noise. The result is a city that is louder and a population that has developed a different and arguably more realistic relationship with what it actually sounds like to live in a city. Number 9. Certain approaches to personal financial arrangements and informal agreements. Russian commercial law exists and governs significant financial transactions in meaningful ways. But in the informal daily financial interactions between ordinary people, in the arrangements that happen outside formal institutional channels, Russia operates with a directness and an informality that the American documentation and liability culture has made extremely difficult to maintain. The handshake deal, the cash transaction between people who know each other, the arrangement based on mutual trust and reputation rather than formal documentation and legal enforcement mechanisms. These things still happen in Moscow in ways that feel natural and that reflect a tradition of personal relationships governing economic interactions that predates formal commercial law by centuries. Whether this produces better or worse outcomes than the American approach of documenting everything and creating legal enforceability for every agreement is a genuine question without an obvious answer. The American approach provides more protection when things go wrong. The Russian approach provides more flexibility and more directness when things go right. Both systems reflect the values and the history of the societies that produced them. Number 10. The relationship with street vending and informal commerce more broadly. Beyond food sales, the informal economy of Moscow operates in ways that American commercial regulation has largely eliminated from most American cities. Street vendors selling a wide variety of goods from tables and carts and improvised displays occupy public spaces throughout the city, with a presence that reflects a long tradition of street commerce that urban planning and commercial regulation in America has generally pushed off public streets and into formal retail environments. The regulation of street vending in American cities is extensive. Permits are required, locations are restricted, operating hours are controlled. The products that can be sold are subject to various regulatory requirements. The result is that the spontaneous, informal, human-scaled commerce that has characterized urban street life for most of human history is largely absent from American cities, where it has been replaced by formal retail in fixed locations with high overhead costs that are reflected in the prices customers pay. In Moscow, the street vendor is still a real and present feature of urban life. The person selling useful things from a table in a public space is still a recognizable part of the city's commercial landscape. The transaction between seller and buyer happens without institutional mediation and without the regulatory overhead that American commercial law requires. This is not without problems. Consumer protections that American regulation provides are absent. Recourse when something goes wrong is limited. But the presence of informal commerce in public space also produces a city that feels alive in ways that highly regulated commercial environments sometimes do not. The street feels used. The public space feels inhabited. The city feels like it belongs to the people in it in a way that is harder to achieve when all commerce is pushed into formal retail environments behind glass doors with operating hours and parking lots. Number 11. Certain approaches to the use of public transportation and public spaces by people experiencing homelessness. This is a complicated area where the comparison between Moscow and American cities requires significant nuance, and where neither system has obviously better outcomes for the people most affected. But the specific American phenomenon of extensive criminalization of homelessness, where sitting on certain benches, sleeping in public spaces, and sheltering in certain areas, is prohibited and enforced through fines and arrests that create legal records that make it harder for people experiencing homelessness to find housing and employment, is less universally present in Moscow's approach to the same population. Russian approaches to homelessness have their own serious problems and their own failures of compassion and policy. But the specific mechanism of criminalizing the behaviors that homelessness requires, such as sleeping somewhere and existing in public space, has not been pursued as consistently in Moscow as in many American cities that have passed sitting bans and camping ordinances and sleeping restrictions, specifically targeting people who have nowhere else to go. Number 12. The general pace and informality of bureaucratic interaction at the street level. Russian bureaucracy in its formal institutional forms is genuinely extensive and genuinely difficult and genuinely frustrating in ways that are well documented and well deserved of their reputation. Getting something done through official Russian channels often involves processes that are long and complicated and require patience that tests the limits of what patience can actually mean. But the informal daily interactions between people at the street level, the small negotiations and arrangements and understandings that make a city function on a daily basis, operate in Russia with a directness and an informality that the American documentation and verification culture has reduced in many contexts. The agreement between two people about something that matters to both of them, reached through direct conversation and maintained through mutual trust, rather than formal documentation and legal enforceability, is still a viable way of conducting business in Moscow in contexts where American liability culture would insist on contracts and signatures and formal verification of everything involved. This informality has costs. It creates vulnerability when trust is misplaced. It provides limited recourse when informal agreements break down. But it also produces a certain kind of human directness in daily interactions that the formalization of everything reduces, and that many people who have experienced both systems find themselves missing when it is gone. Number 13. A different approach to the regulation of certain recreational activities. Russia regulates recreational activities. The regulations are real, and they apply in meaningful contexts. But certain activities that American regulatory environments have surrounded with extensive safety requirements, liability waivers, age restrictions, and formal oversight are pursued in Russia with a directness that reflects a different calculation about acceptable risk and individual responsibility. Recreational fishing without the licensing requirements that many American states impose. Certain outdoor activities in public spaces without the permit requirements that American parks and recreation departments apply. The use of public waterways and public land for recreational purposes without the formal authorization that American public land management agencies often require. These differences are not dramatic individually, but taken together they reflect a consistent pattern in which the Russian regulatory environment in recreational contexts assumes adult competence and accepts individual responsibility for risk in ways that the American regulatory environment, shaped by decades of liability culture and risk aversion, has moved away from. Number 14. The relationship between neighbors and shared residential spaces. In Russian apartment buildings, the relationships between neighbors and the management of shared spaces operate according to norms that are different from the formal regulatory structures that govern American condominium and apartment living. Russian neighbors negotiate directly about shared concerns. They resolve disputes through conversation and mutual adjustment rather than through the formal complaint systems and management company intermediaries that American residential environments rely on. They make agreements about shared spaces and shared resources that are maintained through ongoing social relationships rather than formal contractual obligations. This produces its own problems. Direct neighbor relationships can deteriorate, and when they do, the absence of formal mediation structures can make resolution difficult. But it also produces a kind of direct human accountability in shared living situations that the formalization of residential relationships has reduced in many American contexts where neighbors interact primarily through management companies and formal complaint systems rather than directly with each other. Number 15. The experience of public parks and public green spaces. Moscow has extraordinary parks. The city has invested significantly in its public green spaces, and the result is parks that are genuinely beautiful and genuinely used by enormous numbers of people for an enormous variety of purposes. But the experience of using those parks is different from the experience of using American urban parks in ways that reflect different regulatory philosophies about what parks are for and how they should be managed. In Moscow parks, people bring their own food and drink, including alcohol. They bring their own music. They set up informal games and activities in ways that American park regulations would restrict or prohibit. They use the space with a freedom that reflects the belief that a public park is a public space that belongs to the public, and that the public should be able to use it in the ways that feel natural to them within broad limits of not directly harming others. American urban parks have become increasingly regulated environments where specific activities are permitted in specific areas during specific hours, and where the informal, spontaneous, human use of public space is constrained by management plans and permit requirements and rules about what can and cannot happen in what part of the park at what time. The result is parks that are often beautifully maintained and carefully managed, and that sometimes feel less alive than they might if the people using them had more freedom to use them in the ways that feel natural, rather than the ways that the management plan permits. Number 16. The relationship with personal space and physical contact in public. Russia has a different norm around physical proximity and physical contact between people in public spaces than the American norm that has developed particularly in the last several decades. Russians stand closer to each other in queues and in public spaces than Americans typically find comfortable. Physical contact between friends and family in public, embraces that last longer than the brief American hug, arms around shoulders, hands held between friends of the same gender without any particular significance being attached to it. These things are normal in Russian public life in ways that the American personal space culture has made less common. This is not a legal difference in most cases. American law does not regulate how far apart people must stand from each other in a queue. But the cultural norm is different enough that Russians in America often feel that American personal space expectations are strange and somewhat cold, and Americans in Russia often feel slightly crowded in ways they cannot quite explain. The physical experience of being in public space with other people is different because the unwritten rules about how close is appropriate and what contact is normal are calibrated differently. This reflects something deeper about how the two cultures understand the relationship between individual space and collective presence. American personal space culture reflects a strong individualism that treats the space immediately around each person as a kind of extension of their private domain that others should not enter without permission. Russian norms reflect a different understanding of shared physical space as genuinely shared, as belonging to everyone in it collectively rather than being divided into individual territories that must be respected at all times. Number 17. Certain approaches to the visibility and discussion of personal financial situations. In American culture, discussing your salary or your specific financial situation with acquaintances or even with friends is often considered inappropriate. The reasons for this are complex and involve a combination of competitive social dynamics, privacy norms, and the specifically American discomfort with explicit discussions of class and economic difference. Russians discuss money with a directness that Americans often find surprising or even inappropriate. How much something costs, how much someone earns, what things are worth, what financial difficulties someone is experiencing. These subjects are discussed in Russian social contexts with a frankness that reflects a different norm about what is private and what is simply part of the reality of life that people share with the people around them. This is not a legal difference. American law does not prohibit discussing your salary. But the cultural norm is different enough that it shapes the information environment in which people make decisions and the social context in which economic reality is discussed and understood. The Russian frankness about money produces a kind of economic realism in social interactions that the American norm of financial privacy can obscure. When everyone knows roughly what things cost and what people earn, the gap between aspiration and reality is more visible and more honestly discussed. When financial information is private, the gap can be hidden in ways that produce both individual distress and collective misunderstanding about what economic life actually looks like for most people. Number 18. The relationship with queues and waiting in public spaces. Russians' queue. The queue is a real institution in Russian life, and Russians understand and participate in it. But the relationship between Russians and the queue has a flexibility and a negotiation built into it that American queue culture, which tends toward strict first-come, first-served enforcement, does not quite accommodate. In Russia, it is normal to ask the person at the front of a queue if you can go ahead because you only have one item, or because you are in a hurry, or because of some other circumstance that you explain directly to the person whose position you are asking to take. The person at the front of the queue may agree or may decline. The negotiation happens directly between the people involved. In America, cutting in line is a social violation that is enforced with significant social disapproval and does not typically involve the kind of direct negotiation that the Russian approach assumes is possible. The American queue is a formal institution with formal rules. The Russian queue is a social institution with flexible norms that are managed through direct human interaction. Neither system produces obviously better outcomes. Both systems reflect the values of the cultures that produce them. The American system prioritizes formal fairness over personal negotiation. The Russian system prioritizes direct human interaction over abstract rule following. Number 19. The experience of shopping in markets and the negotiation of prices. In formal Russian retail environments, prices are fixed the way they are in American retail. But in the market environments, in the informal commercial spaces where much of daily shopping still happens in Russia, prices have a flexibility that American retail culture eliminated generations ago. You can ask. The seller can consider. An agreement can be reached that is different from the marked price if both parties find the adjustment reasonable. This negotiation is normal. It is expected. It does not cause embarrassment or confusion on either side because both sides understand that a marked price in a market context is an opening position rather than a fixed fact. The American retail experience has standardized price to the point where negotiation feels inappropriate or even aggressive in most contexts. The marked price is the price. Asking for a different price is socially strange, except in specific contexts like car dealerships where negotiation is expected. The Russian market experience maintains a more direct relationship between buyer and seller in which the final price of a transaction is something that both parties participate in determining rather than something that has been set by someone else and is simply accepted by both sides. This is a small thing in individual transactions, but it reflects something larger about the relationship between commerce and human interaction, and about who has agency in determining the terms of an exchange. Number 20. The relationship with certain aspects of personal appearance and dress in public spaces. Russia does not have the kinds of dress codes that some American institutions and jurisdictions have implemented in public spaces. Russian beaches, Russian parks, Russian public spaces generally operate without the specific clothing requirements that certain American localities have imposed on public spaces in ways that restrict what people can and cannot wear. This is not a dramatic legal difference in most cases, but the cultural norm around acceptable public appearance in Russia is calibrated differently in certain ways. The emphasis on dressing well in public that Russian women in particular have maintained regardless of the occasion is a cultural norm rather than a legal requirement, but it produces a visual environment in public spaces that is different from the American norm and that reflects different values about how appearance relates to public life and public respect. Number 21. The use of mobile phones and photography in public spaces. In America, there is increasing legal and social restriction around photography in certain public spaces and of certain subjects. The laws vary by state and jurisdiction, but the general trend has been toward more restriction on what can be photographed and where. In Russia, the legal framework around public photography is generally permissive in ways that reflect a different balance between privacy interests and the freedom to document public life. People filming and photographing in public spaces in Moscow do so with a freedom that reflects the principle that what happens in public space is genuinely public, and that documenting it does not require special authorization. This is a principle that American law also generally supports, but that American practice has increasingly complicated through a combination of security concerns, privacy expectations, and the specific anxieties that follow from living in a society where everyone carries a camera at all times. Number 22. The relationship with certain aspects of public health and sanitation infrastructure. Moscow has invested heavily in public toilets and public sanitation facilities in recent years, and the situation has improved dramatically. But the Russian relationship with certain aspects of public hygiene and the use of public space for certain bodily functions in contexts where facilities are not available reflects a pragmatism that American public health culture has moved strongly against. The use of certain outdoor spaces in certain circumstances that American public health regulation has prohibited is approached in Russia with the pragmatism of a culture that treats certain human realities as facts to be managed, rather than as violations to be punished. This is not about the absence of standards. It is about a different calculation of when formal prohibition serves public health goals and when it simply displaces behavior without eliminating it. Number 23. Certain aspects of road use by cyclists and pedestrians. I ride a bike through Moscow every day. The infrastructure for cycling has improved significantly in Moscow over the past decade, and the city has invested in dedicated cycling infrastructure in many areas. But the relationship between cyclists and the formal rules of the road in Moscow has a flexibility that reflects the broader Russian approach to traffic as negotiated rather than strictly rule-governed. Cyclists in Moscow use the road in ways that American traffic law would consider violations. They move between pedestrian and vehicle spaces with a fluency that the strict lane discipline of American traffic law does not accommodate. They find routes through the city that use whatever infrastructure makes sense for the journey they are making rather than the infrastructure they are formally assigned to by traffic regulation. This produces its own safety challenges. But it also produces a cycling culture that is more adaptive and more practical than the strict rule following that American cycling infrastructure increasingly demands. Number 24. The relationship with certain aspects of commercial signage and advertising in public spaces. American cities regulate commercial signage extensively. The size, placement, illumination, and content of commercial signs in public spaces are governed by detailed local regulations that reflect concerns about visual pollution, traffic safety, and the aesthetic character of public space. Moscow has its own signage regulations and has actually significantly tightened restrictions on outdoor advertising in recent years. But the relationship between commercial expression and public space has a different history and a different current reality in Moscow than in many American cities where signage regulation has produced a certain visual uniformity in commercial districts. The Moscow streetscape reflects a different negotiation between commercial interests and public space management that produces a visual environment that is in some ways more chaotic and in some ways more alive than the carefully regulated commercial aesthetic of American main streets. Number 25. The experience of nightlife and the relationship between late-night commerce and residential life. Moscow is a city that does not sleep, and the commercial infrastructure that supports late-night life operates with a freedom that American zoning and noise regulation has restricted in many cities. Bars and restaurants operate late in Moscow in residential areas in ways that American zoning would prohibit or heavily restrict. The sounds of late-night life reach residential windows in ways that American noise ordinances are designed to prevent. The presence of people in public spaces at late hours is normal and expected, and the commercial establishments that serve them operate without the early closing requirements that many American jurisdictions impose. This produces a city that feels alive at all hours and that offers the possibility of spontaneous late-night activity that the regulation of nightlife hours in American cities has reduced. It also produces noise and disruption for people who live near commercial areas and who did not choose to live adjacent to establishments that operate until 4 in the morning. The trade-off between vibrant late-night urban life and the quiet that residential areas require is resolved differently in Moscow than in most American cities, and the resolution reflects different priorities about what a city is for and who gets to use it and when. Number 26. The relationship with certain aspects of personal transportation and the rules that govern it. I ride my bike through this city every day, and I see the full spectrum of how Muscovites relate to the formal rules of personal transportation. Scooters and electric bikes and various personal mobility devices move through Moscow in ways that occupy the space between pedestrian and vehicle infrastructure with a fluency that American traffic regulation has struggled to accommodate and has generally resolved by imposing strict rules about where each device can legally operate. In Moscow, the person on an electric scooter finds a path through the city that uses whatever space makes practical sense for the journey they are making. Sometimes that is the road. Sometimes that is the sidewalk. Sometimes that is the dedicated cycling infrastructure where it exists. The formal rules about which space belongs to which device are understood but applied with the pragmatism that characterizes Russian urban navigation generally. The American approach has moved toward strict categorization of personal mobility devices and strict assignment of each category to specific infrastructure with legal consequences for using the wrong space. The Moscow approach trusts the person navigating the city to make reasonable decisions about how to move through it safely given the specific conditions of the specific journey they are making. Both approaches have merit. Both have costs. The American approach produces more predictable behavior and arguably safer individual interactions. The Moscow approach produces more adaptive navigation and arguably more efficient use of available urban space by the people who actually use it every day. Number 27. The experience of interacting with police and law enforcement in daily life. This is a complicated area where the comparison requires significant nuance, because both Russia and America have serious and well-documented problems with law enforcement that affect different populations in different ways. The specific American phenomenon of routine traffic stops that escalate into serious legal situations. The specific American experience of certain populations with police interactions that bear no relationship to the stated purpose of the contact. These are real and serious problems that should not be minimized or dismissed. But the specific Russian experience of routine daily life in the city, the experience of someone like me riding my bike through Moscow delivering packages, involves a level of police interaction that is different from the American experience in certain specific ways. Routine traffic enforcement in Moscow operates with a pragmatism and a negotiability that American traffic enforcement, particularly in jurisdictions with extensive camera-based automated enforcement, does not have. The human interaction between a person and a police officer about a minor traffic matter in Moscow involves a directness and a possibility of resolution through conversation that automated American enforcement systems have eliminated by design. Whether this produces better or worse outcomes overall is a genuinely complicated question. But the daily experience of navigating the city in relation to law enforcement is different in ways that reflect different philosophies about how enforcement should relate to the people it governs. Number 28. The relationship with certain aspects of personal health choices and the state's role in managing them. Russian public health policy has its own extensive history of state intervention in personal health choices, and the relationship between individual health decisions and state authority in Russia is complicated in ways that do not simply resolve into more or less freedom than the American situation. But certain specific American regulatory interventions into personal health choices, the regulation of dietary supplements and certain health products, the specific American approach to the categorization and control of substances that affect personal health and well-being, produce a regulatory environment that restricts certain personal health choices in ways that Russian regulation in the same areas does not. The availability of certain supplements and health products in Russian pharmacies without the regulatory barriers that American health product regulation imposes reflects a different calculation about the appropriate role of the state in managing what adults choose to consume for their own health. This is not an argument that Russian health product regulation is better or more rigorous. It is an observation that it is different in ways that expand certain personal choices while potentially reducing certain protections. Number 29. The experience of urban agriculture and the use of urban and peri-urban land for food production. The dacha culture that I've mentioned already is part of a broader Russian relationship with land and food production that has no real equivalent in American urban and suburban culture. The use of land around the city for personal food production, the maintenance of productive gardens by ordinary urban residents as a normal part of their relationship with the land and the food supply, is a cultural practice in Russia that American urban planning and property regulation has generally made more difficult in urban and suburban contexts. American cities have in recent years developed increasing interest in urban agriculture and community gardens and related initiatives, but these exist as specific permitted exceptions to a general regulatory environment that treats productive land use in residential areas as something that requires special authorization rather than as a normal and unremarkable aspect of how people relate to the land around them. In Russia, the productive garden is not an exception, it is an expectation. The person who has access to any land at all is expected to do something with it. The relationship between urban life and food production is maintained across generations in ways that American urban development patterns and land use regulation have largely severed. Number 30. The relationship between personal debt and social obligation. In Russia, there is a strong cultural tradition of personal financial obligation between people who know each other that operates outside formal financial systems, and that reflects the importance of personal relationships in economic life. Lending money to a friend or family member and expecting repayment, not through formal legal mechanisms but through the social obligation created by the relationship itself, is a normal part of how financial needs are met in Russian social networks. The American approach to personal finance has moved strongly toward formal financial systems and away from informal personal lending networks, both because formal systems provide more reliable enforcement and because the American cultural emphasis on financial independence makes informal financial dependency uncomfortable. The result is a different relationship between personal financial life and social relationships. In Russia, your social network is a genuine financial resource in ways that American financial culture has made less available by formalizing financial relationships and separating them from personal ones. Whether this produces better or worse outcomes depends entirely on the strength and reliability of your social network, and on whether you are the person who needs help or the person who is asked to provide it. Number 31. The experience of certain aspects of public art and creative expression in urban spaces. Moscow has an extensive and growing culture of street art and public creative expression that operates with a freedom and a spontaneity that formal American public art processes do not quite accommodate. Murals and installations and various forms of public creative expression appear in Moscow in ways that reflect a different relationship between creative impulse and the formal permission structures that American public art management generally requires. American cities have developed extensive processes for approving, commissioning, and managing public art that ensure quality and community input and legal clarity about ownership and maintenance. These processes produce public art that is carefully considered and appropriately managed. They also produce public art that takes years from conception to installation, and that reflects the preferences of the institutions that manage the process as much as the creative impulses of the artists involved. Moscow's public creative environment has more room for expression that happens outside formal processes, and that reflects the unmediated creative impulse of the people who make it. This produces some public creative expression that is remarkable, and some that is unremarkable, and some that is actively unwanted by the communities where it appears. But it also produces a visual environment that feels more alive and more personally expressive than the carefully managed public art of American cities. Number 32. The relationship with certain aspects of informal employment and work arrangements. The Russian informal economy is large and significant, and operates in ways that reflect both the limitations of formal employment structures and the cultural preference for direct arrangements between people over institutionally mediated ones. Work that is paid in cash without formal employment documentation, arrangements between individuals for services that are not reported to tax authorities, informal employment relationships that exist outside formal labor law protections and obligations. These things happen in America too and are not unique to Russia. But the scale and the cultural normalcy of informal work arrangements in Russia reflects a different relationship between economic activity and formal institutional structures. The American labor market has moved strongly toward formal employment, with formal documentation and formal legal protections and obligations on both sides. The Russian labor market maintains a much larger informal sector where economic activity happens between people directly without institutional mediation. This produces vulnerability for workers who lack formal protections. It also produces flexibility and directness in economic relationships that formal employment structures reduce. Number 33. The experience of certain traditional practices and their relationship with formal regulation. Russia has a long tradition of practices related to health, food preparation, the use of natural materials and environments, and various aspects of daily life that have their own logic and their own history, and that exist alongside formal regulatory structures rather than being fully encompassed by them. The use of wild plants and fungi collected from natural environments for food and medicine. The practice of traditional health treatments that involve heat and cold and physical manipulation in ways that formal American medical regulation would require specific licensing to provide commercially. The maintenance of traditional food preparation practices that operate outside the standards that formal American food safety regulation imposes. These traditional practices are not formally legal in the sense of being explicitly authorized by regulatory frameworks. They exist in the space that regulation has not reached or has chosen not to regulate because the costs of regulation would exceed the benefits. In America, the regulatory reach into traditional practices has been more extensive and has produced a situation where many things that people have done for centuries require formal authorization to do commercially and sometimes even privately. Number 34. The relationship with natural environments and access to natural spaces. Russia operates under a principle of general public access to natural environments that gives ordinary people the right to enter and use forests and waterways and other natural spaces for personal recreation and subsistence activities without the permission of the owners of that land in most circumstances. This principle, which has deep roots in Russian legal tradition, means that the natural environment around Russian cities is genuinely accessible to the public in ways that American private property law does not provide for. An American who wants to walk through a forested area that is privately owned needs the permission of the owner. A Russian who wants to walk through a forested area that is privately owned generally does not, as long as they are not causing damage and are not interfering with the owner's use of the land. The result is a different relationship between urban populations and the natural environments around their cities. Russians pick mushrooms and berries in forests that are technically privately owned because the law and the cultural tradition support their right to do so. Americans generally cannot do the same without risking trespass. The experience of having genuine access to natural environments as a matter of right, rather than as a matter of permission, is different in ways that affect both how people relate to natural environments and how they understand their own place within them. Number 35. The last thing, the most important thing, the thing that all of these specific differences point toward when you look at them together as a pattern, rather than as individual items on a list. What the differences between what is normal in Russia and what is legal in America reveal, when you look at them together, is not that one country is more free than the other in any simple sense. Both countries have areas of greater and lesser freedom compared to each other. Both countries restrict things that the other permits and permit things that the other restricts. What the differences reveal is that the two countries have made different choices about which freedoms matter most and which restrictions are worth their costs. America has chosen to prioritize formal legal protection of individual rights while accepting significant informal social restriction through cultural norms and economic structures. Russia has chosen to maintain more informal individual freedom in certain daily life contexts, while accepting significant formal restriction in other areas, particularly those involving political expression and institutional accountability. Neither choice is simply better. Both choices reflect the histories and the values and the specific circumstances of the societies that made them. What is valuable is not concluding that one system is superior, but understanding that the choices are real, and that the systems that produce them reflect genuine values that deserve to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as simply wrong or simply inferior. My name is Vladislav. I ride through this city every day. I see all of these things, not as a political statement, not as an argument for any particular system, just as the reality of what daily life looks like on these streets. And now you see it too. This is real Moscow. This is what normal looks like here. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing it. Come back next week, I will show you more, and leave me a comment below. Which of these surprised you most? Which one made you think about your own country differently? I read every single comment, and I answer as many as I can, because the conversation between people who are trying to understand each other across all the differences that separate them is the most valuable thing that a channel like this can produce. Come ride with me. There is always more to see.